Finlandia Foundation National is a nonprofit philanthropic organization founded in Pasadena, California in 1953. It focuses on celebrating Finnish American and Finnish heritage while maintaining ties to contemporary Finland.
Even though this is a book of fiction, how historically accurate is everything?
Yeah, I tried to make it as historically accurate as I possibly could. I spent a lot of time looking things up on the internet, which is a two-edged sword, because you start looking at something and then you wake up an hour later having drifted off into 18 different subjects because you just keep hitting the links. But and I have friends like that logged. You know, a guy I went to high school with who was a logger, and I would check things out with him. And I have a second cousin in Nacelle who's a logger, and I would ask him, and I give them due credit. I have another woman friend who's into historical costume, and she was really, important. And I'd run things by them. I mean, after I'd written it, I'd send copies, and I'd get things back. No, gosh, skirts were shorter in 1920 than they were in 1922. Oh, okay. And it's important for two reasons. One is that I feel like you need to honor those people by being as accurate about their lives as possible.
Welcome to this very special visit with Carl Marlantes, brought to you by Finlandia Foundation National. My name is Kaija Perkiomäki, and I'm thrilled to be here today in honoring Finnish heritage. My parents are founding members of the Columbia Pacific chapter of Finlandia Foundation, and I was a 2015 Finlandia Foundation scholarship recipient. My dad and grandparents moved from Finland to Astoria, Oregon in the 1960s. Astoria is a major area of focus in Deep River, the book that we will be talking about with Carl today. Carl's novel, Deep River, and its story of immigrants and the hardships, joy, pride, and sense of community resonates with the members of Finlandia Foundation. Some of its member organizations started as a Suomi hall, much like where Carl's grandparents danced. New York Times best-selling author Carl Marlantes grew up in a small logging town on the Oregon coast and is a Pacific Northwest native. After attending Yale University on a National Merit Scholarship, Carl joined the Marine Corps and served in the Vietnam War. He received the Navy Cross and multiple other medals for his service. He was also a Rhodes Scholar and attended Oxford University before returning to the Pacific Northwest. He has won numerous awards for his first two books, Matterhorn and What It Is Like to Go to War. He has also appeared in several documentaries on the Vietnam War, including Ken Burns's Vietnam. Carl's latest novel, Deep River, was published in 2019, inspired by his Finnish roots. Carl has strong ties to his Finnish heritage through his grandmother, who immigrated to America from Finland in the early 1900s. The novel chronicles the challenges of life in Finland at the time, as well as the hardships, dangers, and heroism of making life in a new country. Finlandia Foundation National has selected Carl as the special lecturer of 2020, and he joins us today to discuss Deep River and the epic lives of Finnish immigrants in America in further depth.
At the turn of the century, life in Finland was very hard. I mean, Finland was under the heel of Russia. Russia had beaten Sweden in a war and taken over Finland about 100 years earlier, and had promised never to draft Finnish men into the Russian army. So what they did is they formed the Finnish army and drafted them into the Finnish army, and then put the Finnish army into field with the Russian army. And then about the turn of the century, they started drafting them in directly. Industry at the time had been shipbuilding out of wood. Metal ships were being made in America and in England, and that whole business was going away. So the logging was going away, the sawmilling was going away, the shipbuilding. They also faced disease, and they didn't really understand how to control disease in those days, or where it came from. Germ theory had only been developed about 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, in any sense. I mean, even the American Civil War didn't understand germs, and that was 30 years before this time. So they dealt with that as well. And this is a scene that starts off the whole novel, and it's important because three siblings who form the major characters take away from this death of their siblings an attitude toward life, and each of them is very different, and it's how they deal with death and our mortality. And we all choose a path. Some choose, cooking, wine, women, and song. Others become religious. Others just look for money. There's all kinds of ways that we try and stave off, and I've picked three for these characters in particular. And this is the beginning of the novel, which coincidentally for all those non-Finns is the opening of the Finnish national anthem. A thread of light on the eastern horizon announced the dawning of full daylight, and with it the end of a night the Koski family would never talk about and never forget. A skylark called across the rye field, full-throated, pouring out its desire to mate and be fertile. The cold blue sky into which it would rise set back and let it sing. It was on this morning in 1891 that Maija-Liisa Koski returned from a 3-day absence, helping a Swedish-speaking woman from a poor fisherman's family with a difficult delivery. She found her 2 oldest daughters and her baby son laid out in their Sunday clothes on the rough planks of the kitchen floor. Although cleaned just hours earlier, the house still smelled of vomit and excrement. Her husband, Tapio, her oldest son, Ilmari, age 12, her daughter, Aino, age 3, and her now youngest son, Lemminki, 2, were sitting on the floor, their backs against the wall, staring dumbly at the bodies. Maija-Liisa threw herself to the floor beside her dead children and covered their faces with kisses. She'd left them with mild fevers just 3 days earlier, begged by the woman's husband who'd skied and run over 30 kilometers from the coast through the spring thaw to reach her, a midwife renowned throughout the Kokkola region. Knowing that a mother and baby might die, flattered by the heroic effort of the father to reach her, she thought her own children would all pull through. Few survived cholera. When she'd finished crying, she stood and looked at her husband. "We'll bury them tomorrow in the churchyard. I want to be with them today." Her husband said, "Yo." That terrible night marked the children differently. Aino, in whose little arms her baby brother Vainoati had died, learned that no one was coming. She was as alone as the meaning of her name, the only one. Ilmari, ill to the point of staggering, had exhausted himself bringing snow from the remaining patches to stem his sister's fevers. He had fainted and had visions of angels coming for his siblings. When he regained consciousness, soaked with melted snow, his father was slumped unconscious against the ladder leading to the loft where his sisters, Maija-Liisa and Loka, lay dead in the bed all the children shared. From that night, Ilmari knew there was a God, and God was to be feared. But he sent angels. Lemminki, not fully aware of what was happening, retained a vague uneasiness about the future. As he grew older, he realized the wealthy feared the future less than the poor. How wealth was attained was less important than gaining it. The children never knew the name of the woman Maija-Liisa went to help that night, nor the name of her son who survived and grew to manhood, but their fates were linked.
The title of the book is Deep River, and that seems to refer to more than just the river that they settled on. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, Deep River resonates in a lot of ways. The spiritual Deep River is also in the back of my mind, but it also refers to the Columbia River. And the Columbia River, seen throughout the novel, it's the great symbol of life. It's the symbol of the cycles of life and the return of life. And you'll see throughout the novel that it's very much part of Aino's growth in a spiritual sense, too. Strangers came in canoes large enough to hold small villages, and took away the pelts of the sea otter and beaver, leaving iron axes, beads of wondrous color that glowed with light, and an overwhelming knowledge that those who came first had known only a tiny part of a vast world. New villages rose, made of the same cedar and fir, but the dwellings were stiff and angular and had eyes that allowed you to see through their walls. The strangers kept on cutting the cedar and fir, forming the logs into lumber and sending the lumber on the huge ships to the vast unknown world where the trees must not grow. So too, these people without trees were a people without salmon, and the strangers caught the salmon, cut the salmon to put in metal containers, and shipped the containers, as they did the lumber, to the distant, insatiable people who lived where the salmon did not. And the large ships came back for more, and cycled.
Aino heads out alone from Finland to Deep River in the United States at a very young age. How hard was that for her to do?
Yeah, this passage talks about Aino's first real exposure to the west coast, the Pacific Northwest, and to American culture. And, you know, she's very young, a teenager, and on her own. And this describes a little bit of her first coming to Deep River. Deck space on the boat cost her 25 cents. Driven by a huge single-cylinder steam engine, the boat pushed briskly through the choppy water. Far to the west, across Willapa Bay, Aino made out a low-lying shore with huge trees silhouetted against a whitewashed sky. She took shelter from the cold slipstream in the stern behind the crude passenger cabin, watching the thin line of smoke from the boat's boiler fade into the receding distance, acutely aware she was the only woman on board. A fight exploded between two young men shouting curses, one in English, the other in a language she did not know. Some playing cards fluttered away in the slipstream. Other men crowded around the two, none making the slightest move to interfere. The English speaker lunged, but the other man stepped aside, neatly grabbing him and throwing him overboard. The men crowded to the rail, laughing and pointing as the man floundered in the wake, receding with every second. Someone threw a life ring. The boat turned around, and the man was hauled aboard, shivering uncontrollably. He stripped down to his long wool underwear and descended the ladder to stand next to the boiler, oblivious to being exposed in his underwear. Her heart still beating, Aino seemed to be the only one who even remembered the fight. Reaching the mouth of Deep River in the late afternoon, the boat pulled up to a wharf of rough timbers sitting on tall pilings driven into the mud. The skipper hurried because the tide was going out. She scrambled up a wood ladder and someone handed her a satchel as the boat pulled away. She watched it continue south, self-consciously holding her hat to conceal her hair. A cool northwest wind blowing in from the sea to the west, beyond the low-lying peninsula across the bay, pushed her wool skirt tight against her legs, ruffling its hem. She had 5 quarters in the little purse tied to her camisole strap and tucked under her blouse. A man who had left the boat with her and who was loading a small pile of goods into a rowboat tipped his hat politely and said something she could not understand. Although smiling brightly, she could feel her lips trembling. The man sighed, thinking, and then pointed to his chest. "John Higgins." She nodded vigorously and patted her own chest. "I know Koski." The man smiled, held up one index finger, touched her nose with the other, and brought the two together. Koski, Ilmari, Matti. She nodded yes so hard she thought her head would come off. When Ilmari saw his sister pulling on one of the oars of John Higgins' boat as it rounded the bend below Ilmahenki, he smiled, thinking of Uliko's rare attempt at a joke, "So is Christmas." He ran into the water and grabbed the boat's gunwale. Standing thigh-deep in the water, looking at her, he said, "I thought someone was coming." She said, "I have a letter from Mother." They stood, looking at each other, love pouring from their eyes. John Higgins helped her from the boat, shaking his head at their very un-Irish impassivity. Ilmari carried her to the shore and put her down where she stood with the bottom of her skirt dripping, while he returned for her valise and asked Higgins to tell anyone from Reader's Camp who happened by the store to tell Matti that his sister had arrived.
How hard was daily life for a logger?
Yeah, this is her first encounter with Reader's Camp, which in those days, the conditions for loggers were horrible. I mean, there's no other word for it. These were young men, they worked for $1 or $2 a day. They had all the food they could eat, which is the only thing that kept them at the camps. But everything else was just horrible working and living conditions. And this is Aino's first glimpse of a logging camp. She smelled Reader's Camp before she saw it, despite the lime thrown on the feces to reduce the odor of the outhouses. Rounding the final curve, she saw a chaotic jumble of slash, snags, rusting steel cables, and mud, the single most recognizable geometric form being the line of a railroad track that cut right through the middle of the camp. The ground between the structures couldn't be seen through the mass of limbs, discarded small logs, uprooted trees, and abandoned tops not worth sawing into logs. Pigs roamed freely, rooting out garbage, the smell of which had been masked into now by the smell of the outhouses, supplemented by the smell of the pig shit. How could men live in conditions like this? She saw several rough board and batten structures with metal chimneys protruding from their roofs at the far end of the camp, probably the bunkhouses. Closer in, by the tracks, another larger building had been set up high on pilings with a railed porch going around it, probably the cookhouse and the dining hall. Shacks, maybe 12 or 14 feet long by 10 feet wide, each set on 2 large parallel logs, were scattered amid the slash. Most had overlapping split cedar shakes that formed roofs without gutters or downspouts. Some had only canvas roofs. Many shacks had never been leveled, but were just dropped from the rail cars and left where they settled. A few had curtains on single windows set in the rough board and batten siding, suggesting at least some of the men had wives. In the distance beyond the camp stood a ragged line of uncut trees behind a jumbled wasteland of mud, stumps, branches, discarded treetops that apparently weren't worth limbing, and smaller trees, under 2 feet in diameter, left standing for the same reason. Some of the smaller trees had been hit and broken by larger logs being hauled up to where they were stacked, waiting to be loaded on rail cars. It reminded Aino of photographs of artillery devastation she'd seen in a book at Pastor Neiman's about the American Civil War. The uncut trees' lower trunks were without limbs, and so without knots, many climbing for more than 150 feet before reaching the first branches of their dark green tops. Before that line, constantly pushing farther into the ancient forest, was what looked to Aino like a madhouse of wrist-thick steel cables issuing from smoking steam engines set on giant logs. The cables were wound on large drums that looked like thread spools for giants. Spinning rapidly with the power of the steam, logs were reeled in, bouncing and weaving through the slash at speeds faster than a man could run, or perhaps run clear of. The cables, hundreds of feet long, were threaded through blocks, 2 heavy steel plates holding a pulley-like sheave between them, joined at the top by a yoke. The blocks were lashed to huge stumps, providing different angles with which to pull the logs or unwind a cable that had previously been pulled all the way in. Piping whistles, hissing steam, and dark wood smoke boiled from the boilers. These must be the steam donkeys, also called yarders, that Ilmery had told her were rapidly replacing the large teams of oxen or horses that had previously pulled the logs to the water. She could see men crawling under the logs, hooking them with smaller cables to the main large cable, then scrambling clear of the logs that smashed their way to piles being collected around rail spurs. She saw a small boy standing on a tall stump pull on a wire and heard a piercing sound. She'd heard about whistle punks, boys as young as 8 or 9 who worked 12 to 14-hour days down in the steep ravines. Their job was to signal the engineer working the steam donkey that the rigging crew was clear and the log ready to be yanked into motion. If they made a mistake, it could cost a man his life. The steam donkey's whistle tooted in response to the whistle punk's signal, and a big cable went stiff with tension, coming off the ground. She couldn't follow the entire line of it because the terrain was so rugged, but she could see its end where it wound around an anchoring block that must have weighed 1,000 pounds. The block was cinched with a smaller cable to a stump that was at least 14 feet in diameter. How could men weighing 150 pounds have hauled all this dead weight of steel and cable across that terrain? Those men were now scrambling for safety, ducking behind stumps, finding shelter in the torn ground as more steam poured into the donkey's pistons. The massive cable drums whirred, jerking a log weighing several tons from where it lay, bringing it careening through the slash like a runaway railroad car to the landing as fast as the cable drums could turn. Next to the steam donkey sat a railroad engine and 15 pairs of trucks, square timber platforms with wheels. Once loaded with one end of a 36 or 40-foot log, the log's other end loaded on a second platform, the two-wheeled platforms were joined, converting them into a single rail car by the log that they were carrying. Aino stood there transfixed amid the tooting of the whistle punks and the roaring steam donkeys. She became aware of the constant, steady thump and thwack of double-bitted axes and the rasping of 12-foot-long crosscut saws as men felled trees taller than any building Aino had ever seen. Maddie told her that just one of these Douglas firs could produce enough lumber to build 3 or 4 houses. She hadn't believed him. But now, with each splintering, anguished crackle when fibers that held for centuries first started to part, with each moaning, creaking groan as the tree leaned and tore loose from its stump, with the sound of air rushing through the limbs of a rapidly accelerating top, with each ground-breaking crash signaling a tree's death, she believed. Everything about the place spoke of danger and filled her with respect for these men.
How hard was the work for a woman outside of the home?
Yeah, this passage talks about Aino's work with the other girls, and the work that these women did in the logging camps was enormously hard. That's all I can say. It wasn't as dangerous as the work the men did or as physically demanding, but they worked all the time. And one of the things that people don't know about how important it is that those loggers were paid nothing. The only thing that kept them at certain employers was how well they ate. Because if they didn't get good food, they'd just walk off. These were young men, 18 to 25 years old, and they basically worked for food. The work these girls did and the cooks was enormously important to the whole operation. This is her first day or so at work. Walking back to the dining hall happy and relieved that she'd been hired, Aino listened as Alma translated what Reader had said to her. She'd get 50 cents a day. She'd live with the other girls in what was called in English the hen house and sleep on the floor on straw. She was on trial for 2 weeks. If she worked out, they'd get her a bed with sheets and blankets. 100 loggers ate every day, so she'd get every other Sunday off. The girls were good about trading shifts if something came up. After the tables were cleared, she would sit down with the rest of the girls and eat as much as she wanted. There was a tub just behind the hen house with canvas walls for privacy. Before dances, the girls could bring hot water from the kitchen for a single shared bath in order of seniority. Work at Reader's Camp turned out to be the hardest, most unforgiving work Aino had ever done, and she was used to hard work. She and the other 3 girls were up in the dark even in summer. She mixed pancake batter, cut bacon, cracked eggs, made coffee, or frantically tried to keep up her end of an assembly line making dozens and dozens of sandwiches, beef, ham, peanut butter, fried egg, leftover meatloaf, chicken, salmon. At 5:15 a.m., the steam whistle on the train woke them in. The firemen had been tending the fire in the boiler, getting the steam up since 4:30. At 5:30, the dining hall filled with men of all types, mostly young, mostly Scandinavian, but Irish, Slovak, Scots, and Americans as well. Their wiry bodies had the stamina of distance runners combined with the nimbleness of dancers and an astonishing capacity for food. As an aside here, in my research, the average logger in those days consumed 16,000 calories a day. That's Michael Phelps level of work.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, but you imagine 12 to 14 hours of that kind of labor. They really ate. They focused on eating, save for the occasional pass of the butter. No one talked. They devoured pancakes stacked 8 or 9 inches high, slathered with butter, syrup, and molasses, put down bowls of oatmeal drowned in cream, consumed plates of eggs, bacon, and ham, ate beans cooked in a sweet tomato sauce for breakfast, and emptied 6 10-gallon coffee pots, all in about 20 minutes. She never had time to say more than a few words to her brother Matti. After breakfast, the dining hall empty, Aino would watch the loggers clamber into the pre-dawn light, still not talking, the spikes on their boots chewing at the heavy plank floor. Within minutes, she would hear the first shrills of the whistle punks and the clattering of steam donkeys, the singing of steel cables running through blocks and winding onto and off of the huge steam-driven drums, and rending crash of fallen giants whose death she could feel through her feet. Those working more than a mile from the mess hall carried sandwiches of dark, heavy bread she and the other flunkies had prepared scant hours earlier. The rest would walk in for lunch. She would stare at hundreds of dishes and coffee cups, greasy grills on huge wood stoves stretching more than 10 feet, straining to move huge pots of boiling water, pouring the water into sinks, tossing in soap whittled into flakes from 1-pound cakes she would scrub while the other girls, her seniors by hiring date, dried and stacked. Her hands grew red with the heat and harsh soap, but she had no time to worry about that. Prep work began immediately with wood to haul for the afternoon cooking of the evening meal, vegetables to chop for stew, onions to chop for pounds of meatloaf, massive amounts of dried beans to be boiled soft, salmon to butcher for stew or frying, hogs to gut, skin, hang, bleed, and then butcher. Dough to knead for bread, for pies, for cobbler, for dumplings, cream brought up on the rail tracks from places like Ulikos to churn into butter, buttermilk to be mixed with flour and baking soda to make pancakes. Just before dark, the locust herd of 100 men once more descended on the dining hall, some shouting, some quiet, some sullen, some happy, all hungry. Men would shovel 6 or 7 pork chops onto their plates from brimming platters, or 3 12-ounce steaks when beef was served, to be followed by mashed potatoes onto which they stirred honey or smashed tablespoons of butter. Some nights there would be oysters from Willapa Bay. Other nights there would be thick clam chowder. Cabbage and beets were the main dinner vegetables because it was fall. They would change to turnips and rutabagas in the winter. 20 double loaves of bread they'd baked that morning would be gone by the end of supper, along with 200 donuts and 30 apple pies. In about 20 minutes, the huge coffee urns drained, milk pitchers emptied, meat platters left with only traces of grease, the dining hall again would be deserted. Under kerosene lamps, the girls washed and put away the hundreds of plates, cups, and bowls, and set the tables for breakfast. Then there would be the mixing of pancake batter, the carving of bacon slices from huge, large sides, the walking in of the huge metal milk cans full of cream, the loading of the empties back on the rail cars, and finally staggering to the hen house. There, the girls stripped to their underwear and collapsed into bed. Aino onto straw on the floor. Once a week, Aino got her bath after all the others. She distracted herself by doing the math, comparing the surface area of her body with the volume of water, assuring herself that despite the increasingly browner water, there was still a chance she'd come out cleaner than she'd gone in. She yearned for a sauna. 2 weeks passed, and Alma told Aino she was on for good. The promised bed showed up on the back of an empty rail car. She felt a little guilty knowing she got the bed because she was a girl, while the loggers had no beds and slept in 3-bunk stacks on planks covered with straw. She got past that the first night.
There's a passage that talks about a nice Sunday chat. Men and women haven't changed that much since then, have we?
No, this is a scene that I enjoy because Jukka and Axel are both rivals for Aino, and they're both very typically, Finnish and guys, and they come over to help Aino's brother and with one of his projects, and they both end up going into where Aino's living with her brother, and want very much for Aino to like them more than the other guy. So it's a bit of a rivalry here. But you'll see exactly how Finns carry this on, and I kind of like it. Aino's watching out of the window, and she sees both of these guys walking toward her. When Aino saw Jukka coming, she scooted quickly into the house, going to the mirror on the kitchen wall to get her hair in order. She put her glasses in her apron pocket. Then she put them on again and took her apron off. Then she thought better of that and put the apron back on. And then she started again to take off her glasses, and she saw another figure following behind the figure she guessed was Jukka. It was Axel. She smiled. Axel and Jukka came in, taking their hats off, followed by Ilmari. The three standing together, two tall and fair, one not so tall, but dark and broad of chest, made the kitchen feel cramped. She took their hats and motioned them to the table. The three men sat, saying nothing, while Aino poured the coffee and cut each a slice of pulla. "Come to help Matti with the wire rope?" Ilmari asked, after everyone had taken a sip and a bite. "Oh," Jukka replied. Axel just nodded. There was more silence while the men chewed. Aino knew they were friends, but she could almost feel the air quivering. It made her anxious and simultaneously terribly pleased with herself. Finally, Aino asked, "How's it going at camp? Reader keeping to the bargain?" "Yo," Jukka replied. Aino waited to see if anything would follow. It didn't. She looked at Axel. "The savings for the boat coming along?" "Yo," Axel replied. And so it went, until Matti poked his head in the door and Axel and Jukka left. A nice Sunday chat.
Throughout all of your research for this book, how has this instilled a new sense of pride in Finnish culture for you?
Yeah, well, it's really, it strengthened my pride in the culture, because I really was able to get in through my characters in a way into what it must have been like for my grandmother, grandfather, great uncles and aunts, who, think about this, they didn't speak the language. I mean, take some 16-year-old kid, which is I think the age my grandmother was, today, and say, "We're going to send you to the Belgian Congo. There's logging there, and you can work in the logging camps there. And oh, by the way, you don't speak their language, and there's no money to come back, and you're on your own, and here's the ticket." And we send them off. I mean, we'd be horrified. And that's what they did. I mean, they went on their own, no language, no money, just showed up. "I'm going to go to work." And by God, they made it. And they worked hard. They worked all the time. I sometimes would hate to go to my grandmother's house because we just went there and worked all the time. It's like, we got to weed the yard, we got to do this. It was like, you don't read any comic books at grandma's. You'd have to go back to mom and dad's, back to our own house before we could do that. But that was their life, was work. And so again, we are so lazy compared to them. And the other thing is what they could do. I mean, there's not a person in America that could work a 14-hour day with a crosscut saw now. Couldn't. And that was normal. That was normal. The women that worked 12, 14-hour days in the mess halls, doing everything by hand. I mean, you didn't just open up a can and put some Spam on the skillet. I mean, you killed the pig and skinned it and gutted it, and then, amazing, really. So my feeling of pride for how much work they did, and in a way my embarrassment at knowing that we're so soft today compared to those people, it really makes you feel pretty proud to come from that kind of a group of hardy, brave people.
What an astounding, moving saga by Carl Marlantes. Deep River helps us to understand just what it took for so many immigrants to find the courage to leave their homeland and to survive and even thrive in America. And because this story centers on the Koski siblings, it has special meaning for those who are of Finnish descent. Aino, Matti, and Ilmari will be with us for a very long time. I am Anne-Marie Pastor, President of Finlandia Foundation National, sponsor of this Deep River program with our special lecturer, Carl Marlantes. On behalf of Finlandia Foundation, I thank Karl for his participation. There is something special about hearing an author reading his words and sharing information behind the story. Many thanks are due to the Finlandia Foundation National team behind this production, our first online book discussion. I hope all of you have enjoyed it, and I invite you to turn to our webpage and social media for information on future programming. We welcome your support so that we may continue to explore topics related to Finnish culture through projects such as this. To learn more about our organization, please go to finlandiafoundation.org.
I just would like to end by saying kiitos ja muista.
For more of our interview with Carl Marlantes discussing his book Deep River, visit our website at finlandiafoundation.org.